Daniel Collins was a man who lived in glass towers, far above the noise of the city. Every day, he moved between boardrooms, meetings, and private jets. People called him a billionaire, a genius of business, and even a heart of stone. He had everything: money, influence, and power, but he lacked something he never cared to admit. He lacked warmth. Years ago, Daniel had walked away from his family home. He told himself he was too busy, too driven, and too focused to waste time on things that didn't make profit. His father, Mr. Collins, had begged him to visit often, but Daniel always made excuses. "Next week," he would say, "or when I'm free." The weeks turned into years. Their phone calls became shorter, colder, until silence replaced them. But now, silence had broken. On a rainy evening, as Daniel sat inside his luxurious office with walls of glass overlooking the city, his phone rang. It was a number he barely recognized: the hospital. When he answered, his heart skipped a beat. His father's health had taken a sudden turn. The doctor's words were sharp and urgent. "You should come immediately." For a moment, Daniel froze. He was not used to feeling helpless. He was a man who bought solutions with a single call, a man who never waited for anything. But this was different. This was his father, the man who raised him, the man he had left behind. For the first time in years, Daniel felt a crack inside his chest. He left the office without saying a word to his staff. The drive to the hospital felt longer than any flight he had ever taken. The city lights blurred against the wet glass of his car window, and for the first time, Daniel wondered if he had waited too long. When he entered the hospital, the smell of disinfectant and the beeping of machines surrounded him. People rushed past him: nurses, doctors, patients' families. He felt strangely out of place, like a guest in a world he had forgotten. At the reception desk, he said his name. The nurse looked up, surprised. "Mr. Collins. Your father is in critical care. Follow me." As Daniel walked through the narrow hallways, his shoes clicked against the floor, but his mind was far away. Memories flashed in his head. His father teaching him how to ride a bicycle. His father cheering for him at his first school debate. His father sitting alone at the dining table after Daniel had left home. The guilt pressed heavier with each step. When they reached the room, Daniel stopped at the door. What he saw made his throat tighten. His father lay weak and pale on the bed, his breathing rough and shallow. Doctors moved quickly, adjusting tubes and machines. In the middle of them all stood a young nurse. Her name, Daniel would soon learn, was Emily. Her voice was calm but firm, giving instructions and encouragement. Her hands moved with speed but also with care, pressing the oxygen mask, checking his pulse, speaking softly to reassure the old man. Daniel couldn't move. He was frozen at the doorway. He had seen many things in his life: deals worth billions, disasters in the stock market, even political leaders breaking down in front of him. But he had never seen this: a stranger fighting so hard to save his father's life, with a kind of love that Daniel himself had forgotten to give. "Stay with me, Mr. Collins," Emily whispered gently as she adjusted the wires. "You are strong. You are not alone. Just keep breathing." Daniel's eyes stung. No boardroom ever gave him this feeling. No success ever touched him like this moment. His father's life hung by a thread, and the one holding onto it was not his son, but a nurse he had never met before. Time slowed. He wanted to walk inside, to say something, to hold his father's hand. But his legs wouldn't move. Shame filled him: shame for all the years he had been absent, shame for every moment he had chosen work over family. He, the billionaire who could buy the world, could not buy back the years he had lost. Finally, one of the doctors stepped back. "He's stabilizing," the doctor said. A wave of relief swept over the room. Emily gave a small tired smile, brushing the sweat from her forehead. She stayed beside the bed, checking the monitors again, making sure Mr. Collins was safe. Daniel took a deep breath and finally walked forward. He stood beside his father, looking at his fragile form. Then his eyes shifted to Emily. Their gazes met for the first time. Hers was filled with quiet strength. His was filled with guilt and something he hadn't felt in years: respect. In that single moment, Daniel realized something powerful. He had lived his life chasing wealth, yet the richest thing he had ever seen was the kindness of this nurse, fighting for a life that wasn't even hers to protect. And as his father rested, Daniel knew one truth: nothing would ever be the same again. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the soft beeping of machines. Daniel sat in a chair beside his father's bed, his sharp suit now wrinkled, his eyes heavy from staring too long at the monitors. He had never felt so powerless before. In his world, he gave orders and watched things happen. Here, he could only wait. Emily, the nurse who had fought so hard to save Mr. Collins, returned to check on him. She moved quietly, her steps soft, her hands gentle as she adjusted the 4-line. Daniel noticed how carefully she tucked the blanket around his father, as though he were a child who needed comfort. "Is he going to be all right?" Daniel asked, his voice low, almost unsure. Emily looked at him. Her eyes were tired, but they carried a light of calmness that soothed the room. "He is stable for now," she said. "But he will need time, care, and attention. His heart is weak, and stress can make it worse." Daniel nodded slowly. It was strange for him to take advice without questioning. But something about the way Emily spoke left no room for argument. She noticed the way Daniel kept glancing at his father with guilt in his eyes. She had seen this before: family members who returned only when things became critical. She didn't judge him, but she could feel the weight of regret that hung around him like a shadow. "You should talk to him," she said softly while checking the monitor. "Even if he can't answer now, he can hear you. It matters." Daniel looked at her, surprised. No one had spoken to him like that in years. Most people bowed to his wealth, his power, his name. But this nurse, with her simple uniform and calm voice, spoke to him as though he were just another son sitting beside his father. When she left the room for a moment, Daniel leaned closer to his father. His voice shook slightly. "Dad, it's me, Daniel. I know it's been a long time. Too long. I should have been here before, but I wasn't. I'm sorry." His father didn't respond, but Daniel thought he saw a slight twitch of his hand. That tiny movement made Daniel's chest tighten. He swallowed hard, his eyes burning. When Emily returned, she carried a small notebook. She placed it on the bedside table. "This is for the nurses to write down his progress every day," she explained. "You can read it when you visit. And maybe you can add a note to it: encourages patients to know their family is here." Daniel stared at the notebook. A simple thing, yet it felt heavier than any contract he had ever signed. For the first time in years, he picked up a pen, not to sign a deal, but to write to his father. His handwriting was shaky, but he managed. "I'm here, Dad. I won't leave this time." Emily saw the note but said nothing. Instead, she gave him a small nod of approval. As the hours passed, Daniel found himself watching Emily more closely. She didn't just check machines or give medicine, she spoke to patients, smiled at them, comforted families. He saw her kneel beside an elderly woman in the hallway, listening patiently as the woman talked about her late husband. He saw her carry extra blankets to a child who couldn't sleep. Every act was small, but together they painted a picture of quiet strength. Daniel was used to people working for money, for status, for recognition. But Emily's effort came from somewhere else, something deeper. He couldn't understand it fully, but it stirred something inside him. When she returned again to his father's room, Daniel asked suddenly, "Why do you do this?" Emily paused, tilting her head slightly. Do what? Work so hard. Care so much. You don't even know him, Daniel said, glancing at his father. She gave a small smile. Because every life matters. And because one day, someone will fight for me or my family too. That's what kindness is, it goes around. Her words were simple, yet they hit Daniel harder than any business lesson he had ever learned. Later that night, when most of the hospital had gone quiet, Daniel stepped outside the room for some air. He stood by the large window in the corridor, watching the city lights blink in the distance. For the first time, the view didn't impress him. The towers he once ruled over now looked cold and meaningless. Behind him, Emily walked by carrying a tray of medicines. She glanced at him and said, "You should rest too. Tomorrow will be another long day." Daniel turned to her. "Do you ever rest?" he asked. Emily chuckled softly. "Sometimes. But this is my work, and I don't regret it." Then she walked away, leaving Daniel with thoughts he couldn't shake off. As he returned to his father's side, Daniel whispered to himself, "Maybe I've been living wrong all this time." For the first time in years, he didn't think about profits, deals, or power. He thought about his father's weak breathing. He thought about the nurse who had fought harder than he ever had. And he thought about how empty his life truly was. That night, as the machines hummed steadily and Emily's soft footsteps echoed in the hallway, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time: hope. Morning light slipped through the blinds of the hospital room, painting pale lines across the floor. Daniel had not gone home. His suit was wrinkled, his tie was loose, and his eyes were heavy from a night of waiting. Yet he stayed, unable to leave his father's side. Mr. Collins still lay quietly on the bed, his breathing steady but weak. Daniel studied his father's face, noticing every wrinkle, every sign of age that he had ignored all these years. It hit him hard: time had not paused while he was busy building his empire. His father had grown old without him. A knock on the door broke his thoughts. Emily entered, carrying a small tray of breakfast for Daniel. "You should eat something," she said gently. "It's going to be a long day." Daniel looked at the tray, surprised. "You didn't have to." "I did," Emily interrupted softly. "You won't help your father if you collapse yourself." Her tone wasn't sharp, but it held firmness. Daniel, who was used to people obeying him, found himself listening. He ate quietly, watching her as she checked the machines, wrote in the notebook, and adjusted his father's blanket. There was something steady about her presence, something that made the room feel less heavy. After a while, Daniel spoke. "You don't know my father. Yet last night you fought for him as if he were your own family." Emily smiled faintly. "Every patient deserves that. Illness doesn't care about money or power. It makes everyone human again. And sometimes, all they need is someone to fight for them." Her words stirred something inside Daniel. He thought of how he had lived measuring everything in numbers, in profits, in deals. But here was a woman who measured life in kindness. He couldn't remember the last time he had looked at people that way. He leaned back in his chair. I wasn't here for him. Not when it mattered. I kept saying I was too busy. But the truth is, I chose my business over him." Emily glanced at him. Her eyes were calm, not judging. "We all make mistakes," she said softly. "But you're here now. That's what matters to him." Daniel swallowed hard. Her simple words felt heavier than any speech he had ever heard. He looked at his father again. "But what if it's too late?" Emily placed a gentle hand on the edge of the bed, near Mr. Collins' arm. "It's never too late to show love. Even if he can't respond, he knows you're here. Don't waste the time you have now thinking about the time you lost." The sincerity in her voice made Daniel's chest ache. He realized she wasn't just talking about his father, she was reminding him of something he had forgotten long ago. Hours passed. Daniel stayed close, sometimes holding his father's hand, sometimes reading the progress notes Emily had written in the notebook. Each line was filled with care, patient resting calmly. Patient responded to touch. Patient's heart beat stronger after medication. It amazed him. Emily didn't just see numbers and results, she saw moments, small victories worth recording. Daniel began adding his own words, "I sat with you today, Dad. I hope you can feel my hand in yours." Later in the afternoon, Emily returned from another round. She looked tired, but she still smiled when she entered the room. Daniel watched her carefully this time. He noticed her shoes were worn out, her uniform slightly faded, and yet she carried herself with quiet dignity. "Why do you keep smiling, even when you're exhausted?" Daniel asked suddenly. Emily paused, thinking. "Because smiles heal too. Medicine helps the body, but kindness helps the heart. And hearts matter." Daniel stared at her. No one in his business world ever spoke like that. They smiled only when deals were signed, when profits grew. But Emily's smile came from somewhere real. That evening, as the sun began to set, Mr. Collins stirred weakly. His eyes opened just for a moment, cloudy but alive. He whispered faintly, "Daniel, is that you?" Daniel rushed closer, his hand trembling as he held his father's. "Yes, Dad. It's me. I'm here." Tears pricked his eyes. He hadn't heard his father's voice directed at him in years. Mr. Collins' lips moved again, the words barely audible. "Don't waste time." Then his eyes closed, drifting back into sleep. Daniel sat frozen, those three words echoing in his mind. Don't waste time. It was not a lecture. It was not anger. It was a plea. He looked at Emily, who had been standing quietly, giving them privacy. She nodded softly, as if to confirm what his father had said. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt the cracks in his heart widening. All the walls he had built with pride and wealth began to crumble. He realized that if he didn't change, he would lose more than just his father, he would lose himself. That night, as he sat by the bed, Daniel whispered to his father, "I won't waste time anymore. I promise." And for the first time, the billionaire who once thought he had everything felt the true weight of what it meant to have nothing and the fragile chance to make it right. The hospital room was quiet, filled only with the soft hum of machines. Daniel sat in the same chair he had been using for days now, his posture heavy with exhaustion. His father's faint words, "Don't waste time," echoed in his mind like a bell that would not stop ringing. He had heard many voices in his life, business partners demanding results, advisors calculating risks, investors praising him when profits soared. But none of those voices stayed with him the way his father's weak whisper did. It was not just advice, it was truth. Emily entered the room carrying a small chart. She checked the monitors carefully, noting down numbers with her usual calm focus. Daniel watched her, his thoughts restless. Finally, he spoke. "He told me not to waste time. Just 3 words. But it feels like he said everything I needed to hear." Emily looked up, her expression soft. Sometimes the simplest words hold the deepest meaning. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his face buried in his hands. "I spent years away from him. Years I can't get back. I thought success would prove something, that if I built an empire, he would be proud. But what's the use of all that when he needed me and I wasn't there?" Emily set the chart down. She didn't rush to comfort him with empty phrases. Instead, she said quietly, "He's still here. That means you still have a chance." Daniel lifted his head. "But what if he never wakes again?" "Then at least he will leave this world knowing his son is by his side," Emily replied gently. "Sometimes presence is more powerful than words." Her calmness wrapped around Daniel like a blanket. For the first time, he felt like someone was showing him the path he had lost. Later that evening, Mr. Collins stirred again. His eyes opened slightly, and his weak hand searched for Daniel's. Daniel quickly held it, his grip firm but tender. "Dad, I'm here," Daniel whispered. His throat was tight, his eyes glassy. His father's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Daniel, you came back." Tears rolled down Daniel's cheeks. "I should have come sooner. I should have been here for you, for Mom, for everything. I was blind." Mr. Collins squeezed his son's hand weakly. "I wanted you to succeed. But I never wanted you to forget, love." His breathing grew shallow, but his eyes held steady on Daniel's. "Power fades, money fades, but kindness stays. People remember hearts, not empires." Daniel's chest ached. These were not words from a dying man, they were lessons carved deep into his soul. Emily, standing quietly at the other side of the bed, lowered her gaze. She had seen many families break under the weight of regret. But here, in this moment, she saw something different. She saw a man's frozen heart beginning to thaw. The next morning, Daniel walked out of the hospital for a short break. The sunlight felt strange on his face after days of living under fluorescent lights. He stood on the sidewalk, watching people rush by, children laughing, couples walking hand in hand, workers carrying their bags. For the first time in years, he didn't see them as numbers or statistics. He saw them as people, each with a story, each with someone waiting for them. Back inside, he found Emily speaking softly to his father while checking his pulse. She smiled when she saw Daniel. "Your father is a fighter. He's holding on because he wants more time with you." Daniel sat down, guilt and hope wrestling in his heart. "Emily, may I ask you something?" "Of course," she said, adjusting the four. "How do you keep doing this? Day after day, watching people suffer, watching families fall apart? Doesn't it break you?" Emily thought for a moment. "It does hurt. Sometimes I cry when I go home. But I remind myself that even if I can't save everyone, I can still give them dignity, comfort, and love. That matters. It matters more than anything." Her words cut deep into Daniel. He realized how shallow his own goals had been. He had built towers, yes, but they were empty. Emily, with nothing but worn shoes and tired eyes, had built something far greater, a legacy of kindness. That night, Daniel sat by his father again, holding the old man's frail hand. "I heard you, Dad," he whispered. "I won't waste time anymore. I promise I'll be better. I'll be present." Mr. Collins opened his eyes, tears glistening. "That's all I ever wanted, my son." Daniel bowed his head against the bed, his shoulders shaking. Emily quietly stepped out of the room to give them privacy. For years, Daniel had believed power was built on fear and respect. But now he understood true power came from love, from connection, from standing beside the people who mattered. And as the night grew darker, Daniel made a vow to himself. He would not let his father's whisper fade into silence. He would honor it. He would change. Days passed, and Daniel's world slowly shifted. The man who once lived in skyscrapers and boardrooms now spent his hours in the quiet halls of the hospital. His phone, once buzzing non-stop with business calls, lay silent in his pocket. For the first time in years, he didn't care about deals or profits. All that mattered was the man lying in the hospital bed and the nurse who had opened his eyes to a life he had forgotten. Daniel often sat beside his father, holding his hand, sometimes reading to him, sometimes just watching him breathe. He wrote small notes in the progress notebook every day, words of comfort, words of promise. "I'm here, Dad. I won't leave. I'll be better. Thank you for not giving up on me." Emily noticed the change. She saw how Daniel no longer carried himself like the untouchable billionaire everyone feared. Instead, he sat quietly, humbly, with the patience of a son learning how to love again. One afternoon, Emily entered the room and found Daniel carefully adjusting his father's blanket. She smiled faintly. "You're learning fast." Daniel glanced up, a little embarrassed. "I guess I had to." "You didn't have to," Emily corrected gently. "You chose to. That makes a difference." Her words stayed with him. For so long, he had believed he was forced into his path, forced to succeed, forced to chase more, forced to ignore everything else. But now, for the first time, he realized that life was built on choices. And he had the power to choose differently. Outside the hospital room, Daniel began noticing things he had ignored before. He saw a young boy waiting nervously while his mother received treatment. He saw an elderly man sitting alone in the hallway, clutching a photo of his late wife. He saw tired nurses rushing from room to room with no time to rest. He also saw the cracks in the hospital itself, broken chairs in the waiting area, old machines that beeped louder than they should, and walls that needed fresh paint. These details would have been invisible to him before. But now, they mattered. Because they affected people like his father, and people like Emily who worked tirelessly every day. That evening, as he sat with Emily during her short break, he asked her quietly, "Does it always feel like this? Like the hospital is holding on by threads?" Emily gave a tired smile. "We do our best with what we have. The staff work long hours, the equipment is old, but we don't stop. Patients need us. Families need us. That's enough reason to keep going." Daniel thought deeply. In his business, he had invested millions into projects that didn't even matter to him. Yet here was a place where lives depended on resources, and no one seemed to notice. The next morning, Daniel arrived earlier than usual. Emily was surprised to see him walking down the hallway carrying several bags of food. He handed them to the nurses at the station. "I thought you could all use a proper meal. The cafeteria coffee doesn't count." The nurses looked at him in shock, whispering to each other. They were used to wealthy visitors, but not ones who brought them lunch. Emily's lips curved into a smile as she said, "That's thoughtful of you." Daniel shrugged lightly. "It's the least I can do. You're the reason my father is still here." From that day on, he began doing small things. He replaced the broken chair in the waiting area. He quietly arranged for new blankets to be delivered to the hospital. He even brought in a technician to fix an old machine that beeped endlessly. He never announced these gestures. He simply acted. Emily noticed, and though she didn't say much, her eyes reflected quiet appreciation. One evening, as the sun set and painted the hospital walls in warm gold, Emily walked into Mr. Collins' room and saw Daniel sitting beside his father, reading softly from a book. The billionaire looked nothing like the man the world knew. He was gentle, patient, and present. "You've changed," Emily said quietly after the reading ended. Daniel looked up at her. "Maybe I'm just becoming the person I should have been all along." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Your father will be proud." Daniel's eyes softened. "I hope so. I want him to see that I learned. Not just about business. About life." He paused, then added, "I also want you to know something, Emily. Watching you has taught me more than I ever learned in all those years chasing money. You remind me of what really matters." Emily blinked, surprised. She wasn't used to being noticed like that. She had always been just another nurse, blending into the background of other people's stories. But Daniel's words were sincere. That night, after Emily left, Daniel stood by the window, looking at the city lights. They no longer looked like trophies. They looked like reminders of how much time he had wasted. He turned back to his father, sleeping peacefully, and whispered, "Don't worry, Dad. I'll make things right. Not just for you, but for people like Emily, too. And for the first time, Daniel wasn't just speaking of promises. He was already making them real. The hospital had begun to feel like a second home to Daniel. The man who once lived in boardrooms and luxury apartments now found comfort in quiet hallways, the sound of footsteps, and the soft hum of machines. Every morning, he arrived before sunrise. Every night, he left only after making sure his father was resting peacefully. But Daniel wasn't just there for his father anymore. He had started noticing everyone: the nurses who worked long hours with little rest, the families waiting with tired eyes, the patients who needed both medicine and hope. He saw how hard Emily and her colleagues worked and how little they asked for themselves. One evening, while watching Emily patiently explain medicine to a worried family, an idea began to form in Daniel's mind. For years, he had used his wealth only to grow richer, to build bigger towers, to chase recognition. But here was a place where money could mean something real, something life-changing. He kept the thought close, working quietly behind the scenes. A week later, Emily walked into the hospital one morning and froze. Construction workers were in the courtyard, unloading materials. Large boards were being placed, and a sign stood proudly in the center: New Healing Wing, in honor of the nurses who never give up. Emily's heart skipped. She walked quickly inside, looking for answers, and found Daniel standing near the reception, speaking with the hospital director. "What is this?" she asked, breathless. Daniel turned to her, a rare softness in his eyes. "It's something this hospital needs. A new wing with better equipment, more rooms, and space for families to stay close to their loved ones. I've funded it completely." Emily blinked, stunned. Why would you do this?" Daniel's voice was quiet but steady. "Because I saw you fight for my father like he was your own family. I saw how hard you and the others work with so little. You showed me what kindness really looks like, Emily. I wanted to honor that." She looked at the sign again, reading the words slowly. Not in his name, not for his reputation, but for the nurses. Her throat tightened. "You didn't have to." "I did," Daniel interrupted, echoing the same firmness she had once used with him. "This isn't about me anymore. It's about making sure people like you have what you need to keep saving lives." That day, whispers spread through the hospital. Staff and patients alike spoke of the new wing, the donation, and the billionaire who chose not to put his name on it. Many couldn't believe it. But Emily knew. She had watched the change in him day by day, the way he had learned to listen, to notice, to care. Later that evening, Emily found Daniel sitting beside his father, as usual. Mr. Collins was resting, his breathing steady, his face calmer than before. She stood quietly for a moment before speaking. "Do you know what you've done today?" Daniel glanced at her. "I built something useful, for once." "You built hope," Emily corrected softly. "For patients, for families, for us." Her words made Daniel smile faintly. "Then it's worth more than all the towers I've ever built." The following days were filled with planning and construction. Daniel worked closely with the hospital team, not as a distant donor but as someone who cared. He visited the workers, asked the nurses what they needed, and listened with patience. The man who once demanded results now sought understanding. Emily often watched him with quiet admiration. She had met many wealthy visitors in her years of nursing, but most came and went with little thought beyond their own lives. Daniel was different now. He stayed. He listened. He changed. One afternoon, as they walked together down the hallway, Emily said softly, "You know, your father would be proud of what you're doing." Daniel looked ahead, his eyes thoughtful. "I hope so. I used to think pride came from success. Now I see it comes from love, from kindness. That's what he always wanted me to learn." Emily smiled. "And you did. Maybe just in time." That night, Daniel sat beside his father once more. The old man stirred, his eyes opening faintly. Daniel leaned closer. "Dad, the hospital is building a new wing. For families, for patients, for the nurses who fight every day. It's all for you, and for them." Mr. Collins' lips trembled into a small smile. His weak hand lifted just enough to squeeze Daniel's fingers. A single tear rolled down his cheek. Daniel bent closer, whispering, "I learned from you. And from her. I won't waste time anymore. I'll make every day count." His father's eyes closed again, but the smile remained. For Emily, that moment said everything. She had seen families break, she had seen them heal, but rarely had she seen such a transformation. A man once defined by his wealth had discovered something greater heart. And though Daniel didn't say it out loud, Emily understood. His warm move wasn't just building a wing in the hospital. His warm move was rebuilding himself into the son his father needed and the man he was always meant to be. The hospital was quiet that morning. Sunlight poured gently through the tall windows, spreading warmth across the clean white halls. Daniel sat beside his father's bed, as he had done for weeks. Mr. Collins was stronger now. His breathing was steady, his face brighter, and his voice carried a little more energy each day. For Daniel, those mornings had become the most precious part of his life. Gone were the rushed phone calls and the endless meetings. Instead, he learned to listen to stories of his father's youth, to the advice he had once ignored, and to the simple silence they now shared without needing words. Emily entered the room with her usual smile, holding a tray of medicine. She greeted Mr. Collins first, her voice light and cheerful. "Good morning, sir. Ready for another day of getting stronger?" Mr. Collins chuckled softly. "With you around, I don't think I have a choice." Daniel smiled at the exchange. Every time Emily walked into the room, the atmosphere seemed to change. She brought not only care but also hope, and it was something Daniel knew he could never repay fully. The construction of the new wing was almost complete. The walls were painted, the rooms were furnished, and the halls carried the fresh smell of new beginnings. Nurses and doctors often peeked inside with wide eyes, excited about the changes. Families who had once crowded into small waiting areas now had proper space. One evening, the hospital director gathered the staff and patients in the courtyard for a small celebration. A simple ribbon hung across the entrance of the new building. Daniel stood quietly in the back, not seeking attention. But when the director spoke, his name could not be left unmentioned. "This new healing wing is possible because of a man who chose kindness over recognition," the director announced. "On behalf of everyone here, we thank Daniel Collins for his generosity." Applause filled the courtyard, and Daniel felt the heat rise to his face. He hadn't expected it. For once, he wasn't standing before investors or media. He was standing before people whose lives would truly be changed. Emily looked at him with pride, whispering, "You should step forward. They need to see the man who cared." Slowly, Daniel walked to the front. He didn't prepare a speech, but words came naturally. "This isn't about me," he began softly. "This is about the people who work day and night, the nurses, the doctors, the staff who never give up on anyone. I only wanted to give them the tools they deserve. My father is alive because of them. And I want every family to feel the same hope we did." For a moment, the courtyard was silent. Then came another round of applause, louder, warmer, more heartfelt than anything Daniel had ever heard in his business career. After the ceremony, Daniel returned to his father's room. Mr. Collins was sitting up, smiling proudly. "You've changed, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not because of money, but because you finally understand what it means to care." Daniel sat beside him, holding his father's hand. "I should have learned sooner, Dad. I wasted so much time. But I promise you, I won't waste another moment. Tears welled in his father's eyes. That's all I ever wanted, for you to live with heart, not just with wealth. Days turned into weeks, and Mr. Collins grew stronger. One bright morning, Emily walked him out of the hospital with Daniel at his side. The old man took his first steps outside in months, breathing in the fresh air deeply. Birds sang overhead, and the world felt alive again. You see this? Mr. Collins said, looking around with joy. Life is a gift. We should never take it for granted. Daniel looked at Emily, then at his father, and nodded. I won't. Not anymore. Though his father was discharged, Daniel continued visiting the hospital. He sat with lonely patients, sponsored new programs, and built friendships with the staff. For the first time, people saw not just a billionaire but a man who cared. Emily often teased him, "You've become part of the hospital family now." And Daniel would reply with a smile, "Maybe this is the most important family I've ever had." One evening, as the sun set behind the city, Daniel stood in front of the new healing wing. The windows glowed warmly, filled with life. He thought about the man he used to be: distant, cold, lost in numbers. Then he thought about the man he had become: a son, a friend, someone who had learned the true meaning of kindness. Emily joined him, her voice soft. "You know, your next move really did warm everyone's heart." Daniel looked at her, his eyes gentle. "No, Emily. It was your kindness that lit the way. I only followed." She smiled, and for a moment, they stood in peaceful silence, watching the lights of the hospital shimmer like stars. And so, the story of a billionaire who once lived only for himself ended with something greater than wealth. Daniel found not just his father again but also a new purpose: to live with compassion, to give with love, and to never let another day pass without meaning. The hospital became more than a place of healing for the sick. It became the place where a hardened heart was healed, where kindness built bridges, and where a son finally learned how to love.